That afternoon, Kris Kristofferson had about 4 seconds to make a decision that would last the rest of his life. If he let the take continue, something he'd carefully kept separate from his public work would become permanent, pressed into vinyl, impossible to retract. He stopped. The engineer's hand froze over the console. The band held their instruments in confused suspension. Kris stood at the microphone, eyes closed, and said the only thing that would end the question before it started. "Let's try it different." No one asked what he meant. The session was booked for a Tuesday in November 1973 at Columbia Studios in Nashville. Kris had flown in from Los Angeles the night before, carrying a leather notebook he hadn't opened in front of anyone. Inside were lyrics to a song he'd been avoiding for 8 months. Not because it wasn't good, but because it was too accurate. The working title was Colder Water. The label wanted it for the next album. His manager had heard a demo and called it the strongest thing Kris had written in 2 years, which meant Kris couldn't bury it without explanation, so he agreed to record it. He arrived at the studio early, before the session players. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and old carpet. He sat alone with his guitar, running through the song in his head. Not the lyrics, but the places they came from. Specific rooms, specific silences. The kind of material that sounded like storytelling, but was actually just memory with better rhythm. When the band arrived, Kris didn't mention what the song was about. He just played it through once, explained the tempo, and they began. The first take was technically clean but emotionally distant. Kris sang it like a well-constructed piece of fiction, which is what he needed it to be. The engineer gave a thumbs up through the glass. Kris shook his head. One more. The second take had more presence. His voice dropped into the lower register, where he kept the things he didn't say in interviews. The guitarist leaned in. The drummer softened. It was starting to feel like the song could matter to people. Kris felt the danger in that. He asked for a third take. This time, he didn't think about technique. He let the first verse happen naturally, the way it sounded when he was alone. His phrasing loosened. The pauses between lines stretched just long enough to suggest he was remembering, not performing. By the second verse, he'd stopped monitoring himself. The lyric that had always felt like observation, distant, almost journalistic, was now sitting too close to his actual life. The line about explaining yourself into a corner wasn't metaphorical anymore. The image of apologizing for clarity was something he'd done 3 weeks ago in a conversation he was still thinking about. He reached the bridge. It was the part of the song he'd written last, the section that turned everything before it from confession into framework. If he sang it the way it was written, the song would complete itself as art. If he sang it the way he felt it, the way that was trying to surface in his throat right now, it would be something else entirely. The band was locked in. The take was perfect. Kris opened his mouth. For one measure, he sang it honestly. His voice carried a weight that wasn't in the melody. The lyric, already vulnerable on paper, became something he hadn't intended to release. It sounded like the difference between "I understand what happened" and "I still don't know how to live with it." The engineer leaned forward. Kris saw the movement through the glass. He stopped singing. The band fell out of time, confused. The drummer's sticks hovered. The bass player glanced up. Kris stood at the microphone with his eyes closed, breathing carefully, as if he'd just caught himself before falling. The engineer's voice crackled through the talkback. "That was sounding great, Kris. What happened?" Kris didn't open his eyes. "Let's try it different." "Different how?" "Just different." There was a pause, the kind of silence studios are built to avoid. The engineer waited for clarification. The band waited for direction. Kris waited for the question to expire naturally. It did. "Okay," the engineer said finally. "From the top?" "From the top." The fourth take was controlled. Kris sang the bridge the way it was written, artfully, with just enough restraint to sound thoughtful rather than withheld. The emotion was still present, but now it was translated into something performable. The difference was subtle enough that no one in the room could identify what had changed, except Kris. He knew exactly what he'd removed. When the take ended, the engineer gave an emphatic thumbs up. "That's the one." Kris nodded. He set the guitar down and walked into the control room to listen back. The playback sounded good. Professional, the kind of song that would fit comfortably on an album without demanding too much attention. It had weight, but not the kind that made people ask questions. The engineer was pleased. You want to punch in anywhere, or should we keep that? Keep it. Great. That's a wrap on this one. Kris sat in the control room for another 20 minutes, ostensibly listening to the other tracks they'd recorded that day. But he wasn't hearing the music. He was thinking about the take he'd stopped. It had only been a few measures, maybe 8 bars where his voice had done something he hadn't authorized. But those 8 bars contained a version of himself he didn't let exist in public, not because it was false, but because it was too complete. The song as it now existed was honest, accurate, even. It just wasn't whole. No one asked why he'd stopped the third take. The session players were professionals. They'd seen artists chase perfection through dozens of attempts. If Kris wanted a different performance, that was his prerogative. But it hadn't been about the performance. It had been about the 4 seconds when he'd forgotten to keep distance between what he understood and what he felt. The moment when his intelligence, usually a reliable tool for framing emotion into something manageable, had stopped protecting him. That version of the song would have required explanation, or worse, no explanation at all. People would have heard it and recognized something he'd spent years learning how to contextualize instead of confront. So he'd stopped. And in stopping, he'd made a choice that would define how the song existed in the world. The album was released 4 months later. Colder Water appeared as track 6. Critics called it reflective and mature. A few reviewers noted Kris's characteristic restraint. One writer described it as the sound of a man thinking clearly about difficult things. No one called it a confession, which meant he'd succeeded. The song performed moderately well. It wasn't a single, but it got occasional radio play. People wrote letters saying it had helped them make sense of their own lives, which Kris found both gratifying and quietly ironic, since he'd specifically edited out the part of himself that hadn't made sense of anything. He never told anyone about the third take. 2 years later, a music journalist interviewed Kris for a career retrospective. They went through the albums chronologically, and when they reached Colder Water, the journalist asked what had inspired it. Kris gave a thoughtful answer about emotional transience and the cost of self-awareness. He talked about the song's structure, the decision to keep the arrangement sparse, the way certain images can carry more weight than exposition. It was a good answer, intelligent, articulate, true in all the ways that mattered publicly. The journalist nodded, satisfied, and moved to the next question. In 1981, a young songwriter asked Kris for advice about a song she was working on, something personal she wasn't sure she should release. Kris listened to her demo, then asked her a question. If you put this out, will you spend the rest of your career explaining it, or will it explain itself? She thought about it. I'm not sure. Then you're not done writing it yet. She looked confused, but it feels finished. Feeling finished and being ready to live with it aren't the same thing. She released the song 2 years later, after significant revisions. It became her most successful single. In interviews, she always cited Kris's advice as pivotal, though she never fully understood what he'd meant. Kris never clarified. By the mid-1980s, Colder Water had become a deep cut that serious fans appreciated, but casual listeners rarely mentioned. It existed in the catalog as a well-crafted song that showcased Kris's lyrical precision without demanding too much emotional labor from the audience, which was exactly what he'd needed it to be. Occasionally, someone would ask him to perform it live. He usually declined, saying it didn't fit the set list or the arrangement required musicians he didn't have on the road. Both reasons were technically accurate. The actual reason was simpler. He didn't trust himself to sing it the same way twice. In 1989, a documentary filmmaker was compiling archival footage for a retrospective on 1970s Nashville recording culture. She contacted Columbia Studios asking for session tapes from that era. The studio sent over boxes of material, including the November 1973 session where Kris had recorded Colder Water. The filmmaker listened through everything, looking for usable footage. She found the first take too stiff, the second take better but incomplete, the fourth take the one that made the album. She also found the third take, the one Kris had stopped. She listened to it 3 times, trying to understand why it had been abandoned. Technically, it was flawless. Emotionally, it was extraordinary, possibly the most vulnerable performance on any of the tapes she'd reviewed. She called Kris's manager to ask if they'd consider using it in the documentary. The manager said he'd check with Kris. Kris listened to the third take alone in his home studio. He hadn't heard it in 16 years. It sounded exactly like he remembered. Not better, not worse. Just unprotected in a way that made him understand, again, why he'd stopped it. The filmmaker wanted to use it as an example of the creative process, how artists refine performances towards something more effective. She thought the abandoned take demonstrated Kris's commitment to craft. She had no idea what she was actually hearing. Kris called his manager back. "Tell her we'll stick with the album version. She really loves the earlier take. I'm sure she does. Any particular reason you don't want it used?" Kris paused. He could explain it. The difference between artistic choice and self-preservation, the way certain performances reveal more than they intend, the cost of letting people hear you before you've decided what you're willing to be understood as. But explaining it would require admitting there was something to explain. "Just doesn't fit the story she's telling," he said finally. His manager accepted that. The documentary used the album version. In 1993, Kris was interviewed by a graduate student writing a thesis on authorial intent in songwriting. She asked whether he ever recorded material he later felt was too honest. Kris smiled slightly. "Honesty's not the problem, it's completeness. I'm not sure I follow. You can be honest about what you understand. That's easy. Being honest about what you don't understand, that's harder to let exist on a record. So you self-edit? Everyone does. The question is whether you're editing for clarity or for protection. Which do you do?" "Both. Depends on the day." She published the interview in an academic journal. The quote was cited in several papers about performative authenticity in folk music. None of them understood what he'd meant. By the late 1990s, Colder Water had been covered by 3 different artists. Each version was competent. Each missed something essential that even Kris couldn't articulate, because the thing they were missing had never made it onto the recording. He listened to the covers with detached curiosity, the way you might observe someone describing a room you'd once lived in. They got the furniture right, the dimensions, the light. They just didn't know what had happened there. In 2003, a music historian was cataloging unreleased session material for a box set retrospective of Kris's Columbia years. She found the third take of Colder Water again, now transferred to digital, cleaned up, remastered. She wrote an enthusiastic email to the label. "This version is stunning, much more raw than the album cut. Strong candidate for inclusion." The label forwarded it to Kris's team. Kris's response was brief: "Album version only." The historian pushed back gently, arguing for the historical value of alternate takes. Kris's team replied that he preferred to let the original creative decision stand. The third take remained in the archive, unreleased. In 2011, a journalist asked Kris if he had any regrets about his catalog, songs he wished he'd recorded differently, or material he'd left unreleased. Kris thought about it for longer than the journalist expected. "There's a version of one song," he said finally, "that I'm glad doesn't exist publicly." "Which song?" "Doesn't matter. Point is, sometimes the right decision is knowing what not to share." "But don't you think audiences deserve to hear artists at their most vulnerable?" "Deserve's a complicated word. People deserve honesty. They don't necessarily deserve access to every stage of how you got there." The journalist didn't follow up. The moment moved on. Kris still performs occasionally. When he does, people sometimes request Colder Water. He's learned to play it in a way that honors the album version, controlled, reflective, just distant enough to remain sustainable over 200 performances. He never sings it the way he did in the third take. That version exists only in an archive in Nashville, labeled as an alternate take, cataloged but unreleased. Occasionally, someone discovers it during research and suggests it should be heard. Kris always says no, not because it's bad, not because it's incomplete, because it's the 4 seconds he chose not to make permanent. The moment he stopped protecting himself with intelligence and let something unframed reach the microphone. The brief space where understanding stopped being enough and feeling threatened to take over. He made a decision that day. He's lived with it comfortably ever since. And the song, as it exists in the world, remains honest, well-crafted, and carefully incomplete, exactly as intended.